Moving to an old Victorian house in upstate New York felt like the fresh start I needed. After the chaotic buzz of Manhattan, I craved silence, a place where the only sounds would be the scratch of my pen on paper and the hum of ideas drifting through my mind. The house, though old and a little battered, had an eerie charm to it, almost as if it were waiting for someone like me to bring it back to life. As a suspense writer, it felt oddly fitting, almost poetic, to take up residence in a house with such history. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different. It was thick, as if carrying whispers that had lingered in the walls for years. The place had been vacant for decades, so it didn't surprise me that it smelled a little musty. But even as I unpacked, there was an unsettling sense that I wasn't alone. Dismissing it as my imagination, I focused on making the house my own, hoping it would begin to feel less like a stranger. My first night was quiet, but I couldn't shake a strange feeling. Every now and then, I heard faint creaks coming from somewhere above me, almost as if footsteps were wandering the upper floor. But old houses make sounds. That's what I told myself each time the floorboards groaned and the wind whistled through the cracked windows. I spent the next few days setting up my office. The room was at the far end of the hallway with a single, large window that overlooked the backyard, where tangled weeds and wild vines had taken over. In one corner of the office was a sturdy old desk, built from heavy wood, clearly a relic from another era. I'd been excited to find it left behind, feeling as if I'd inherited a piece of the house's story. While dusting the desk, my fingers brushed over a lock on one of the drawers, rusted and unyielding. It was an unusual feature, one I didn't remember noticing during my initial tour. The drawer seemed almost hidden, as if it was trying to keep its contents a secret. Curiosity got the better of me, and after a bit of effort, I pried it open. Inside was a manuscript, its pages yellowed and brittle, with a title that sent a chill through me, the final chapter. The author's name was unreadable, faded by time, but something about it felt familiar. I flipped through the pages, and within the first paragraph, I could feel the hairs on my arms prickling. The story was about a writer, a solitary man who had moved to a new house, hoping to finish his novel. The description matched my life almost perfectly. I chuckled nervously, chalking it up to coincidence. Writers often create characters who reflect their own lives, and this could easily have been some long-forgotten work left by the previous owner. Still, the similarities were eerie. The protagonist of the final chapter was named John Templeton, a man who, like me, found himself alone in a quiet house with only his thoughts and his typewriter. As I read on, though, the feeling of familiarity deepened into something darker. The plot was simple but unsettling. Templeton moves into a house, hoping to find inspiration for his writing. But soon he begins to hear things, soft whispers, creaking floors, and the faint shuffle of footsteps at night. The descriptions of the house were startlingly accurate, down to the lone window in the office overlooking a neglected backyard. At that moment, the clock on the wall chimed, its hands stopping at precisely 3:15 a.m. The sound startled me, echoing in the stillness, but I laughed it off, realizing I'd lost track of time. I'd become so engrossed in the manuscript that hours had slipped by unnoticed. Setting the pages down, I made my way to bed, my mind buzzing with thoughts of the story and its eerie resemblance to my own life. But as I lay there, I couldn't help but feel a cold dread creeping in. Every sound in the house felt amplified, the creaks in the hallway, the wind tapping against the window. I told myself it was just the power of suggestion, that reading about someone else's haunted experiences was bound to make me feel jumpy. I tried to push it from my mind, sinking deeper into the covers, willing myself to sleep. The next day, I couldn't resist the pull of the manuscript. I sat up at the desk, flipping to the pages I hadn't yet read, telling myself it was just a story, nothing more. But with every page, the line between fiction and reality blurred further. The writer Templeton had written about hearing his name whispered from darkened corners and seeing fleeting shadows lurking in the periphery of his vision. I glanced around my own office, half expecting to see something, anything, moving in the dim light. I laughed at my own paranoia, but the manuscript had left a mark. Every description, every whispered fear felt like a premonition. I forced myself to continue reading, hoping to find some clue that would explain it all. But the more I read, the more trapped I felt. It was as if the words on the page had a life of their own, pulling me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. That night, the house felt colder. The walls seemed to close in, heavy with secrets. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself it was all in my head. After all, I was just a writer in a new, unfamiliar house, letting a story get under my skin. But somewhere, deep down, I knew that something was very, very wrong. The following days passed in a blur. I tried to ignore the strange pull of the manuscript, but each morning, as soon as I'd poured my first cup of coffee, I found myself back at the desk, poring over its brittle pages. It was like a compulsion I couldn't shake. The writing style was simple yet haunting, with every word chosen as if to unsettle. And the eerie parallels with my own life continued to deepen, each line weaving a web that felt like it was tightening around me. Templeton, the protagonist, was no longer just a character in a forgotten manuscript. He was becoming real, a version of myself, experiencing things that seemed to foreshadow my own life. He was alone, like me, in a house that seemed to breathe and pulse with a life of its own. The house in the story creaked and whispered as mine did, but it was what Templeton found in his house that sent chills down my spine. Strange markings carved into the walls, faint scratches near the windows, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw its way inside. One night, lost in the manuscript's pages, I became aware of a faint scraping sound. It seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside my office. The rational part of my mind argued it was just the old house settling, but another part, a darker, more instinctual part, felt the hairs rise on my arms. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting a story mess with my head, but the sound persisted. It was faint, like a dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Curiosity, or perhaps something darker, got the best of me, and I went to the door, opening it a crack. The hallway was empty, the dim light casting long shadows. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something odd. Near the baseboard, a thin line of scratches was etched into the floor, trailing off down the hallway toward the stairs. The sight left a chill settling in my bones. It was too similar to Templeton's experience in the story. I closed the door and returned to my desk, my mind racing. Each day the manuscript seemed to grow darker, as if it were leading me somewhere deeper into its twisted narrative. The writing began to take on a more frantic tone, describing Templeton's descent into paranoia. He was haunted by strange occurrences in the house, compelled to investigate noises and shadows, all while battling the feeling that he was no longer alone. The deeper he dug, the closer he felt to uncovering a terrible truth lurking within the walls. He described hearing his name whispered in empty rooms, seeing fleeting figures out of the corner of his eye. I found myself growing paranoid as well. Every creak, every shifting shadow felt like a warning. One evening, as I tried to work on my own novel, I heard it, a faint whisper from somewhere down the hall. My name carried on a voice so soft it barely seemed real. "Jack," I froze, my heart hammering against my chest. My rational mind tried to convince me it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the sound came again, more distinct this time, like a murmur just on the edge of hearing. The whispers seemed to drift down the hallway, fading into the distance. Trembling, I forced myself to get up and check, convinced I would find no one. The hallway was empty, silent, except for my own shallow breathing. I felt foolish, haunted by a story I'd found locked away in a dusty drawer. But no matter how much I tried to brush it off, the feeling of unease persisted. The house felt colder, the shadows seemed to stretch farther. I returned to the manuscript, hoping to distract myself, but the words on the page only mirrored my growing dread. The next section of the manuscript described Templeton's realization that he was being watched. He would catch glimpses of movement just beyond the edges of his vision, shadows that seemed to dart out of sight whenever he turned his head. I read with growing discomfort, each line striking closer to my own experiences. I could feel it, too, a presence, something that seemed to linger in the quiet, watching and waiting. Then came a passage that sent a shiver down my spine. Templeton described finding messages scratched into the walls, warnings etched by someone or something that had come before him. He discovered the words "Leave now" scrawled in jagged letters near his office door. The handwriting was frantic, desperate, as if written by someone who had tried to escape but failed. Feeling a sudden urge, I stood and went to check the walls near my own office door. I half expected to find nothing, but there, etched into the wood, was a single word: run. My breath hitched, and for a moment I felt a strange disconnection from reality. I blinked, staring at the crude carving. It looked fresh, the edges still raw, as if someone had gouged it in a panic. Yet I hadn't heard a sound, hadn't seen anyone. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the word. Was this some kind of sick joke? A prank left by the previous owner? But the timing was too perfect, too chilling. I retreated to my office, shutting the door as if it could somehow keep the terror at bay. The word "run" lingered in my mind, echoing like a dark command. That night I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something watching me, hovering at the edges of my vision. I left the light on, hoping the soft glow would keep the shadows at bay, but it did little to calm my nerves. I lay awake for hours, listening to the silence, half expecting to hear my name whispered again. By morning, I was exhausted, but I couldn't resist returning to the manuscript. It felt like an addiction, a dark need to know what happened to Templeton. He was losing his grip on reality, unable to tell what was real and what was imagined. He was hearing whispers, seeing shadows, finding warnings scrawled into the walls. The deeper I read, the more I felt as though I was staring into a mirror, watching my own descent unfold before me. By now, sleep had become a luxury. Each night, I lay in bed, wide-eyed, watching shadows dance along the ceiling, listening for any hint of sound. The manuscript had consumed me. Every line I read seemed to pull me deeper into a darkness I couldn't escape. I'd never felt so vulnerable, so stripped of any sense of security. It was as if the house itself had turned against me. Templeton's descent into paranoia mirrored my own. In the final passages, he spoke of feeling watched every moment, even during the day. He felt hands reaching for him in the dark, shadows creeping closer each night. My chest tightened as I read his words, my heartbeat matching his fear. The lines between his story and my reality were blurring, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The manuscript wasn't just a story, it was an echo of my own life, a prophecy. One night, the fear finally broke through. I decided to burn the manuscript, convinced it was the source of everything wrong in the house. Trembling, I grabbed the brittle pages and made my way to the fireplace, determined to watch it all turn to ash. But when I tried to set it aflame, the pages wouldn't burn. The fire crackled, licked the edges of the paper, but the words remained untouched. The manuscript seemed to resist, as if it were bound by something far beyond my understanding. Desperate, I returned to my office, clutching the cursed pages. I sat there, staring at them, feeling the weight of its words press down on me. My mind raced as I tried to piece together what was happening. Was it some twisted game, a trap laid by whoever had written the manuscript? Or was the house itself forcing me to finish what someone else had started? I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, but eventually I couldn't resist the compulsion any longer. I opened to the final chapter, the one I hadn't yet read. The pages felt cold under my fingers, as if something dark and ancient had seeped into the paper. Templeton's story was drawing to a close, and with each sentence, I felt as if I were walking with him, step by step, down a path I couldn't turn back from. As I read the last lines, my breath hitched. Templeton had discovered that he was not alone in the house. There was something in the shadows, a figure that lurked just out of sight, watching him with eyes that burned through the darkness. He had tried to escape, to flee, but every door he opened led him back to his office, where the manuscript awaited him. The final words written on the page were a command, stark and cold: turn around. The words sent a chill down my spine. I knew I was alone, but I couldn't resist the urge to glance over my shoulder. Slowly I turned, the fear gnawing at me. The room was empty, but the shadows felt heavier, as if they were thickening, pressing in around me. A cold, damp chill filled the air, and I felt the hairs on my neck rise. I tried to stand, to leave, but my legs felt glued to the chair, my hands clutching the manuscript in a death grip. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a dark figure in the doorway. It was a shadow, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I froze, my body paralyzed as the figure moved closer, soundless, like it was gliding through the darkness. I tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was rooted to the spot, helpless. The figure stopped mere inches from me, and though it had no face, I could feel it staring at me, feeding on my fear. My mind raced, searching for an escape, but I was trapped. The manuscript lay open in my hands, and I felt its words pulling me deeper, binding me to the chair, to the room, to the story. Somehow, in the haze of terror, I realized what I had to do. My fingers shaking, I picked up the pen on the desk and began to write. It was as if my hand was guided by something beyond my control, each word pouring onto the page like blood from an open wound. I was writing my own ending, following in Templeton's footsteps, sealing my fate. The words flowed, almost as if the figure itself were dictating them, and with each sentence the air grew colder, the shadows darker. "I am not alone," I wrote. "I can feel its presence. It is here, watching me, waiting. It will not let me leave." And as I wrote the last line, "It has taken me," the figure moved closer, its hollow eyes inches from mine. I felt its icy breath on my neck, felt the weight of its presence pressing down on me, squeezing the last bit of hope from my chest. The last thing I remember is the coldness seeping into my bones, the feeling of falling into a darkness so deep that there was no escape. The manuscript slipped from my hands, its pages scattered across the floor, and I felt myself drift away, swallowed by the shadows. When they found my body days later, the manuscript lay open beside me, its final page blank, as if it were waiting for the next reader to pick it up, to continue the story, to become its next victim. Moving into a new apartment in Seattle was supposed to be my fresh start, a quiet, simple place where I could finally live alone, in peace. After years of roommates and shared spaces, this apartment felt like my own personal sanctuary. It was a modest space, just big enough for one, with large windows that overlooked a street lined with trees and a few quaint, older houses that gave the neighborhood its cozy charm. On my first night, I took in the stillness, the quiet hum of the city that seemed to fade in the evening, replaced by a calming silence. I was settling into the routine of being alone, but there was something strange about the apartment. It was subtle at first, little things I convinced myself were products of my overactive imagination. Lights flickering occasionally, the floor creaking in rooms I wasn't in, and an odd chill that filled the living room every night. I shrugged it off as quirks of the old building, chalking it up to an overworked mind adjusting to a new place. Seattle was known for its rainy, moody weather, which could make any place feel a bit eerie. And as a horror enthusiast, I figured I was probably just letting my own interests play tricks on me. The apartment had an odd charm, old-fashioned with narrow hallways, low ceilings, and vintage fixtures. I convinced myself it only added character, making the place feel unique, like I'd stepped into some forgotten time capsule. But after a few days, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. At night, as I sat on my couch with only a soft light glowing, I could feel it. A heavy, unsettling sensation pressed against my back, like eyes burrowing into me. It was absurd. I'd laugh it off, tell myself I was just being paranoid, and force myself to ignore it. One particular evening, while I was reading on the couch, a sudden power outage plunged the apartment into darkness. The entire block seemed to have lost power, and the city lights outside were gone, leaving an eerie, thick silence. I let out a sigh, feeling my way through the dark until I found my phone, using its faint glow to navigate. The chill returned, seeping into my bones as I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just the cold draft of an old apartment. I sat back down on the couch, clutching my phone for light, when something caught my eye, a figure in the corner of the room. My heart skipped a beat as I instinctively pointed my phone toward it. It was just a shadow, I told myself, my mind playing tricks in the dim light. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the unease. The figure was tall and dark, almost like a person standing in the far corner of the room, completely still. I froze, barely breathing, unable to look away. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just a play of shadows. Yet no matter where I moved the light, the figure stayed in place, solid and unmoving, as though it was watching me. The air grew colder, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to get up, to move, but I was paralyzed with fear, caught in a silent, unyielding stare. My rational mind tried to break through the terror, whispering that it was just a shadow cast by the dim light, a trick of the dark. But I knew, deep down, that there was something more. The figure didn't shift, didn't flicker like a shadow would. It remained there, silent, immobile, as if it had taken root in that corner of my living room. Finally, the power returned with a faint hum, and the lights blinked back on. I held my breath, scanning the corner with the light flooding the room. The figure was gone, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. I exhaled, trying to shake off the chill that lingered, telling myself I'd imagined it, a product of the shadows in my own mind playing tricks on me. But as I stood up, gathering the courage to approach the corner, my gaze fell on something that made my blood run cold. There on the wall where the figure had been standing was a handprint, dark and smeared, like someone had pressed their palm against the wall with force. I reached out, my fingers hovering inches from the mark, afraid to touch it, afraid it would vanish like the figure had. The handprint looked fresh, the edges smudged slightly, as though someone or something had just been there, watching me from the darkness. I backed away, swallowing the terror rising in my throat, and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. But the handprint remained, a silent reminder of the presence that had lurked in the shadows. I sat down, shaken, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Who or what had been there? I could still feel the weight of its stare, lingering in the air, pressing down on me with an unnatural heaviness. That night, I barely slept, every creak and groan of the apartment reminding me of the figure, wondering if it would return. The following morning, I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened, brushing off the events of the previous night as some mix of my imagination and the eerie setting of a power outage. But the image of that handprint lingered in my mind, a dark stain of fear I couldn't shake. I'd made sure to wipe it off the wall, thinking that maybe removing the evidence would somehow lessen its grip on me. But I couldn't deny it. I had seen something that wasn't a trick of the light, something that felt all too real. Days passed, and while the apartment seemed to return to normal, I never quite felt alone. Every time I walked into the living room, I felt like I was being watched, as if invisible eyes were tracking my every movement. The fear started creeping into my routine, casting a shadow over everything. I began leaving the lights on in every room, unwilling to let even a hint of darkness settle around me. Each time I tried to ignore the lingering tension, something small would happen to pull me back. A light would flicker, or a door would creak open on its own, just enough to remind me that whatever I'd seen hadn't truly left. One evening, as I sat reading on the couch, I heard a faint rustling sound. My first thought was that it was coming from the hallway outside the apartment, but as I listened, I realized it was closer, inside my living room. I held my breath, gripping the edges of my book as I waited, hoping the sound would stop, but it only grew louder, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. I told myself it was nothing, just the old building settling. But when I glanced up, I saw it, a shadow creeping across the wall, moving slowly, deliberately. It glided along the wall as if it had a life of its own, and this time I could feel the cold air settle around me, pressing down on my skin, heavy and oppressive. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in place. The shadow paused in the corner of the room, the same corner where I'd seen the figure on the night of the blackout. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it hadn't moved on. It was waiting. Slowly, I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight and directing it at the corner. The light cut through the darkness, but the shadow remained, stubbornly clinging to the wall. It was as if the light couldn't touch it, as if it existed beyond the realm of normal shadows. Panic surged through me, and I dropped the phone, its light rolling across the floor and casting strange dancing shapes along the walls. The shadow stayed motionless, watching. I could feel its presence, its cold gaze pinning me in place, as if daring me to move. After what felt like hours, I forced myself to stand, my heart pounding as I backed away from the living room. My hand reached for the doorknob of my bedroom, and without thinking, I slipped inside, closing the door firmly behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the silence, waiting for any sign that the shadow had followed me. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of my own breathing, the silence pressing down on me. I told myself to calm down, that it was just a shadow, just the light playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it, the cold, lingering presence that hadn't been there before, growing stronger with every passing day. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow in the corner, its form twisted and dark, watching me with unseen eyes. I could feel it creeping closer, inch by inch, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. The next morning, I was exhausted, but determined to figure out what was happening. I began searching for any signs of previous residents, hoping to find some history that could explain the strange occurrences. In the building's records, I discovered that the apartment had a long history of tenants who had come and gone quickly. Most of them had left without explanation, breaking leases and moving out within months. My research led me to one former resident who had left particularly abruptly. I found an old newspaper clipping that mentioned her, a woman named Emily who had lived in the same unit a few years prior. She had reportedly left after experiencing a series of unexplained events, though the article was vague on details. The more I read, the colder the room seemed to become. There was a photograph accompanying the article, and in the background, I recognized the very corner of my living room where I had seen the figure. A handprint was visible, faint but undeniably there, pressed against the wall like a silent warning. My blood ran cold. It was as if the apartment itself were haunted, carrying the marks of those who had come before me, each one leaving behind a piece of their terror. That night, as I sat alone in my living room, the lights flickering softly, I felt a new kind of fear settle in. The shadow hadn't left. It was waiting, lurking just beyond the reach of the light, watching my every move. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe, to hold onto a shred of sanity. But as I sat there, something brushed against my arm, a cold, soft touch that made my skin crawl. My eyes flew open, but there was nothing there, only the empty room and the oppressive silence that seemed to mock my fear. I knew then that this was only the beginning. Whatever presence lingered in my apartment wasn't just a shadow. It was something darker, something that wanted me to feel its presence, to know that I was never truly alone. I couldn't bring myself to spend another night alone in the apartment, but I knew I had to confront whatever was haunting me. The thought of running away, of leaving everything behind, crossed my mind more than once. But each time I looked toward the door, something in me felt paralyzed. It was as though the apartment itself didn't want me to leave, like it was holding me here, tethered by an invisible force. I spent the next few hours pacing, my nerves fraying with every sound, every flicker of light. The unease was growing, morphing into something more sinister, a sense that the shadow was growing bolder, that it was no longer content to stay in the corner. That night, as the hours ticked by, I felt the apartment's energy change. The silence grew deeper, as if the walls were absorbing every sound, amplifying my fear. Around midnight, the lights began to flicker, casting brief flashes of illumination across the room. Each time the light returned, I saw it, the shadow creeping closer, inch by inch, as if it were alive, drawn to me. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I found myself clutching my phone tightly, unsure whether to reach for the light or to keep the room dark. A cold draft settled over me, like invisible fingers pressing against my skin, and I felt the unmistakable weight of a presence hovering just out of sight. In a panic, I decided to confront it once and for all. I shone the flashlight into the corner where the figure had first appeared, hoping to find some rational explanation, something to shatter the illusion. But as the light sliced through the darkness, the shadow didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to grow denser, more defined. I could almost make out the shape of a face, hollow and dark, staring back at me. My voice caught in my throat as I demanded, "Who's there? What do you want from me?" The words felt feeble, like they dissolved into the thick silence swallowed by the very walls. I waited, heart pounding, but there was no answer. Just the steady hum of the building, the soft flicker of the lights, and the weight of that invisible gaze. Then, Just as suddenly as it had begun, the flickering stopped, and the room fell into an oppressive silence. The figure had vanished, leaving the corner empty once more. But as I moved closer, cautiously inching forward, I saw it, a fresh handprint, smeared and pressed right beside the original one on the wall. I stumbled back, a cold shiver creeping up my spine as I realized the handprint was larger, like it was somehow growing. Desperation took hold, and I knew I couldn't stay another moment in that apartment. Whatever was there, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was coming for me. Grabbing my bag, I fled the apartment, not daring to look back. My heart was racing as I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap, jolting me back to reality. I found myself gasping for breath, the terror clinging to me like a second skin. But as I stood in the street, trying to steady myself, I felt an eerie sensation creeping up my spine, a feeling that I wasn't alone, even here. Against my better judgment, I turned, glancing back at the apartment building, half expecting to see something watching me from the window. And there, in the darkness of my living room window, I saw it. A faint shadow, staring down at me, as if marking my departure, claiming the space I'd left behind. I moved to a friend's house that night, swearing I would never set foot in that apartment again. But the sense of unease, the heavy presence, lingered with me, as if the apartment's darkness had followed me, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. Days later, I received a call from the landlord, asking why I'd left without notice. I tried to explain, stammering through half-hearted excuses, but I knew he wouldn't believe the truth. Before hanging up, I asked if he knew anything about the apartment's history. There was a long pause on the other end, a silence heavy with hesitation. Finally, he muttered, "You're not the first to leave because of something like that. People say that apartment has its own presence, but they always come back, one way or another." A chill settled over me as I hung up the phone. The landlord's words echoed in my mind, haunting me long after I'd left the apartment. And as I sat alone in my friend's guest room that night, I felt it. The cold, creeping sensation that had plagued me before. The silence stretched, suffocating, and in the dim glow of the streetlights outside, I noticed it. A faint, smeared handprint on the wall beside my bed. Moving into an old house nestled in the rural stretches of Massachusetts was supposed to be a dream come true. I had always wanted a quiet place to call my own, somewhere I could work on my illustrations without the constant distractions of city life. And this house, a two-story, creaky Victorian from the late 1800s, seemed perfect. It had character, history, and just enough charm to make me feel like I'd stepped back in time. The property itself felt like something out of an old photograph. Tall, gnarled trees lined the yard, their branches tangled above like protective arms. The house stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, secluded from the main road. It was surrounded by dense woods, making it feel even more isolated, but I'd convinced myself that was part of its appeal. The idea of silence and solitude was exactly what I needed to focus on my work. On my first day, as I moved my boxes into the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching me. I knew it sounded ridiculous. How could an old house be watching? But there was something about it, the way the shadows clung to the corners, how every floorboard seemed to groan in protest when I walked by. I chalked it up to nerves. Moving into a new place, especially one as old as this, could do strange things to a person's mind. That first night was surprisingly quiet. I sat on the worn, faded couch that had been left behind, flipping through a few of my favorite books. Occasionally, I'd hear a slight creak from somewhere above, but I assumed it was just the house settling. Old places like this always made sounds, right? When I finally went to bed, I felt oddly at peace, lulled by the gentle sounds of the wind rustling through the trees outside my window. But it didn't take long for things to change. The second night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of wood creaking, like footsteps pacing slowly down the hallway outside my room. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I held my breath, listening intently, but the sound continued, slow and steady, moving back and forth. My heart began to race, my mind cycling through a dozen possible explanations. Maybe it was just the wind or the old wood shifting, but something about the sound felt too rhythmic, too deliberate. Every night after that, the sounds grew louder. The footsteps would start around midnight and wouldn't stop until the early hours of the morning. It became a ritual, me lying in bed, counting the creaks, my body tense and alert as I waited for them to pass. I would tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was nothing. But each night, they seemed to grow closer, the footsteps creeping down the hallway, inching ever nearer to my bedroom door. By the end of the week, I was losing sleep, my mind frayed by exhaustion and the constant sense of unease. The house felt different now. The charm I'd seen in its old-fashioned walls and worn floors was replaced by an oppressive heaviness, as though the very walls were pressing in, suffocating me with their silence. I decided I needed to figure out where the sounds were coming from. Maybe if I saw it for myself, I could put my fears to rest and finally get a good night's sleep. I waited until midnight, sitting on the edge of my bed, the faint light from my bedside lamp casting long shadows along the walls. The creaks began, as they always did, starting from the far end of the hallway and moving closer, each one slow, deliberate. With my heart pounding, I stood and opened my door, stepping into the dimly lit corridor. The hallway stretched ahead of me, long and narrow, lined with faded wallpaper and scattered with old portraits that seemed to watch me with empty, indifferent eyes. I held my breath as I listened, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. But as I moved forward, something strange caught my eye. Near the center of the hallway, one of the floorboards seemed slightly raised, almost as if it had been disturbed recently. I knelt down, running my hand over it, and felt a faint gap along the edge. Curiosity flared, momentarily overriding my fear, and I pressed down. The board shifted, revealing a small space beneath it. My fingers found a latch hidden just below the surface, and I pulled, feeling the resistance of wood scraping against wood. As I lifted the board, I uncovered a narrow, dusty passage, barely wide enough to fit through. The air that rose from it was stale, carrying with it the scent of age and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. My skin prickled with a sense of dread, but I couldn't stop myself. There was something down there, something that had been hidden for who knew how long. I shone my flashlight into the passage, my hand trembling as the beam illuminated a steep, narrow staircase descending into darkness. The wood was old, rotted in places, with deep scratches gouged into the steps. I hesitated, my mind racing with 100 questions. Who had built this, and why had it been hidden? But more than anything, I wanted to know what was at the bottom. Maybe it was nothing, just an old cellar or some forgotten storage room. But part of me sensed something else, a secret buried in the depths of this old house, waiting for me to uncover it. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the staircase, each creak of the wood echoing in the silence. My flashlight's beam wavered, illuminating walls lined with old, peeling wallpaper and cobwebs that clung to the corners like wisps of forgotten memories. I was halfway down when I saw them. Books, or rather, journals, stacked on crude shelves built into the walls. They were coated in a thick layer of dust, their pages yellowed and brittle, as though they hadn't been touched in years. Reaching for the closest one, I wiped away the dust and flipped it open, my eyes scanning the first line. I hear them every night. The footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was my imagination, but it's not. Something is here, watching. My blood ran cold as I continued to read, my heart pounding with each word. The entries spoke of sleepless nights, of shadows that seemed to move on their own, of a figure that lurked in the corners, always watching, always waiting. And as I read, I felt a chill settle over me, as if something or someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I couldn't shake the words I'd read in that journal, nor the feeling of cold breath against my neck. The entries were short, fragmented, but each was laced with a quiet, desperate fear that felt all too real. Whoever had written them was haunted by the same sounds, the same presence, and for how long, I couldn't tell. The pages were undated, but the brittle texture and faded ink told me they'd been there for a long time, perhaps as long as the house itself. Over the next few days, I found myself drawn to the hidden passage like a moth to a flame. Each night I'd descend those narrow steps, the walls seeming to close in around me as I picked up one journal after another, reading through entries that chronicled decades of strange occurrences. Some were simple observations: footsteps, the creaking of floorboards, shadows shifting where there should be none. But others were darker, filled with details that made my skin crawl. One entry, written in a jagged, frantic scrawl, described a night when the author had seen something: a dark figure standing in the hallway, staring at them from the shadows. They had frozen, unable to move, watching as the figure drifted slowly closer, its form wavering, almost as if it were part of the darkness itself. The entry ended abruptly, the ink smeared, as if they had dropped the pen in a rush to escape. I started sleeping with the lights on, unable to bear the thought of darkness settling around me. But the nights grew more oppressive. The sounds in the hallway continued, only now they seemed louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get my attention. And it wasn't just footsteps. Now there was a faint scratching, as though someone or something was dragging its nails along the walls. One night, lying awake, I heard the creaking footsteps come to a stop just outside my bedroom door. My heart raced as I lay there, holding my breath, waiting. I could feel the weight of something standing on the other side, the silence thick and suffocating. And then, just as I thought it had passed, a light knock echoed through the room. Soft, almost polite, as if asking permission to enter. I froze, paralyzed by a fear that felt cold and sharp, sinking into my bones. I couldn't bring myself to respond, couldn't even muster the courage to move. But the knocking continued, each tap against the wood more insistent, more urgent. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. The next day, I went back to the journals, desperate for answers. I needed to know what had happened to the previous owners, why so many of them had left without a trace. And as I read, I began to piece together a story of a family that had lived here long ago, a family that had vanished one night, leaving only their belongings and these journals behind. One of the journals, dated decades ago, belonged to a woman named Eleanor. Her entries were filled with detailed descriptions of the house, her family, and a presence she referred to only as the Watcher. She wrote about how it would stand in the hallway, how she could feel it even when she couldn't see it, an invisible weight pressing down on her every time she closed her eyes. In one of her last entries, she described an attempt to confront it. She had waited in the hallway late one night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Watcher. But instead, she had felt a chill settle over her, a darkness that seemed to seep from the walls. She wrote about a voice, soft and barely a whisper, that had called her name, inviting her to follow it. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Eleanor's final entry was short, a hastily scrawled line that read, "It's here. It's finally here." After that, the journal ended, leaving me with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. That night, as I lay in bed, I could feel a shift in the air, a heavy silence settling over the house. The usual creaks were there, but they were different, slower, like someone deliberately pacing, each step measured and careful. I pulled the blankets tighter, my heart racing as I listened to the sounds moving down the hallway, stopping just outside my door. This time there was no knock, no scratching, just silence. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and low, whispering my name. It was barely audible, a faint sound that seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. "Evan!" I bolted upright, every muscle tense, my mind racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too many late nights reading those journals. But the voice had been so clear, so real. I could still feel the chill it had left in the room, lingering like a faint, ghostly presence. The next morning I tried to brush it off, to convince myself it was nothing. But the fear clung to me, a constant weight that followed me through every room, every hallway. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was in this house, it was growing bolder, and I was no longer just an observer in this story. I was a part of it. Desperate for answers, I spent the next day scouring every inch of the house, searching for anything that could explain the presence that haunted these walls. In a small, hidden closet, I found one final journal, buried beneath a pile of old blankets. It was worn, its pages fragile and yellowed, but the words inside were unmistakable. They spoke of a ritual, a way to confront the watcher, to force it to reveal itself. The entry was filled with warnings, each one more desperate than the last, but I knew I had no choice. If I wanted to escape this nightmare, I had to face whatever was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. That night, I prepared myself, reciting the words from the journal, hoping that they would offer some protection. I stood in the hallway, the air thick with tension, my heart pounding as I waited. And as the footsteps began once more, echoing through the silence, I knew that whatever was coming for me was finally ready to show itself. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and silent. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, every sense alert, as I stood there waiting, clutching the journal tightly. The house seemed to breathe around me, each shadow deepening, pressing closer. I had spent the day preparing myself for this moment, memorizing the words that the journal claimed would call forth the watcher. Now, standing alone in the dim hallway, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. The silence grew heavy, almost suffocating, as I began to recite the words. They were unfamiliar, strange syllables that felt thick on my tongue. As I spoke, the temperature dropped, and a cold draft swept through the hallway, ruffling the pages of the journal in my hand. I continued, my voice barely above a whisper, feeling an odd compulsion to keep going, even as fear clawed at my chest. And then, I heard it, the first creak of the floorboards. The sound was faint at first, coming from the far end of the hallway, just where the darkness was thickest. I could make out a figure, tall and shadowed, standing in the gloom. It was almost like watching something emerge from a fog, its form wavering, as if it were part of the shadows themselves. The figure stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, the wood groaning under its weight. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure was unlike anything I'd ever seen, its outline barely human, shifting and dark, like a void that absorbed all light. My heart raced as it drew closer, its presence filling the hallway, oppressive and cold. I could feel it watching me, its gaze heavy and unyielding, as though it were peering into the depths of my soul. Desperation gripped me, and I continued reading from the journal, hoping the words would protect me, would somehow drive this thing back. But the figure didn't stop. It was relentless, moving closer, step by step, until it was mere inches away. I could feel the chill radiating from it, seeping into my skin, chilling me to the bone. In a last-ditch effort, I spoke the final line of the ritual, my voice breaking, barely a whisper. "Reveal yourself and be gone from this place." For a moment, everything was silent. The figure seemed to hesitate, its form flickering, as if my words had struck something deep within it. And then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers layered over each other, it spoke. The sound was soft, almost gentle, but filled with an ancient malice. "You summoned me." The words echoed through the hallway, filling the air with a sense of dread so profound I felt rooted in place. The figure raised an arm, and for the first time, I saw a hand emerge from the shadows, long and skeletal, its fingers stretched and twisted like gnarled branches. It reached out toward me, each movement slow, deliberate, as if savoring the terror it inspired. In that instant, I knew I had to get out. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the silent house as I fled down the stairs and out the front door, leaving the journal and everything behind. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. I stumbled into the yard, gasping for breath, my mind racing. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes watching me leave. I felt an odd sense of finality, like it was letting me go, but not without marking me somehow, as if I was now part of its history. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher had followed me, that it was still watching from the corners of my vision, lingering in the shadows. I moved out of the house, left it to sit empty once more, but the memories followed me. Every creak of floorboards, every shift of shadow in my new apartment reminded me of that place. I didn't need to return to know that the watcher was still there, waiting for the next curious soul to disturb its rest. And as for the journal, I never went back to retrieve it. The last night I spent in that house haunts me still. I can feel it watching, that cold, hollow gaze lingering, as if the watcher marked me, as if it will never truly let me go. I left, but I know it's still there, waiting, patient, bound to that house, and perhaps bound to me.